Okay, thank you. First talk after tea. I'll fill in. They'll miss all the stuff at the beginning and ask questions. Um, okay, so I'm going to kind of follow up on the talk I gave yesterday, which was about um, the steps that we followed to figure out the information needed for management, and talk about the actual how Bonefish and Tarpon Trust works. For those of you who weren't in that talk, Bonefish Tarpon Trust is a nonprofit science-based organization that uses collaboration kind of as our key. So first basically give a definition of a boundary organization that you can see here is to enable or enhance communication and information transfer between stakeholders, scientists, resource managers, and policymakers. That's the official definition. I think all of those are stakeholders. Stakeholders are often termed to say the fishing community, but the resource managers, the scientists within the agency, et cetera, they're all stakeholders. They're all have an involvement. So on the left there, you see fishing guides are actually pulling nets to catch bonefish rather than hook and line, which is a big deal. Tournaments are another big one. This is my colleague in the center there in Mexico, speaking to both the fisheries manager and the governor of the state. And then, thankfully, 2 years ago, we hired a VP of policy, so I no longer have to put on a suit and tie and go to Washington, D.C., which is much better for my state of mind. So our conservation focus, obviously, so a few more definitions here. Habitat-dependent recreation depends on relatively intact, functional natural systems that support the core aims of the activity. Again, in my case, talk about the flats fishery. The picture there kind of shows you the pristine environment that most of the participants are looking for. That participant, and there was a talk yesterday about the gradient from a beginner generalist all the way up to a specialist towards the end, kind of a process of someone's growth in an activity. And so the more avid ones that stick with it become specialists, and that often leads to stewardship. And those become the champions that are the kind of first point of contact for BTT when we enter a new area, and then they kind of are the influencers for the rest of the community. And then that brings us to what type of boundary organization Bonefish and Tarpon Trust is. And I'm sorry for the wordy definition. A colleague came up with that, so I can't take credit for it. But basically, we engage the habitat-dependent recreationist, and the key thing here is engagement and to help set and or achieve conservation goals. We don't come in as an NGO and say, this is what has to happen, you need to support us. It's a collaborative process to figure out with the stakeholders often taking the lead to figure out what we need to do research-wise, conservation-wise, etc. As I mentioned yesterday, because of the pristine environment that the outdoor recreationists are looking for, that gives broader biodiversity benefits as well. So we often work with what you might call traditional conservation NGOs collaboratively. U.S. examples of these types of groups, Ducks Unlimited is a pretty famous one, 1937, a long time. If it wasn't for DU, the U.S. probably wouldn't have any wetlands left, to be honest. And that's because duck hunters said we have a problem. And now they're one of the most powerful conservation organizations in the country. Another one you may have heard of, Trout Unlimited, 1959. They started for the exact same reason, loss of trout habitats, and they were based in Michigan and now are nationwide. And you probably have some in your areas as well. As I talk about this, I think it's important for us to not think that we're doing this anew. This has been going on for at least 50 years. Johans has publications from the 70s and into the 2000s about community-based marine resource management in the Pacific, mostly in the Pacific Islands. And so what we're doing isn't new. We're improving it, but especially for the students in the audience, I strongly encourage you, when you do your literature reviews, go back in time to see what happened before. Too often these days, I'm seeing, quote, ideas that are presented as new, and they're not, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but more importantly, we can learn what they've done before and avoid a lot of mistakes. So for the students in the room, for sure, whatever you're involved in, take a look back at the historical stuff for sure. So the next thing I want to talk about is information silos, and I'm sure we all experience them. Most fisheries are managed by the stock assessment method. And you can see all the some of the different factors that are used for that. What's not included in most fisheries management is another information silo, which we focus on a lot, and that's fish habitats. What the fish need to do, where to be in order to be successful. And you can see a whole list of habitats there. Another silo are the recreational fishing community. They have a lot of local ecological knowledge, a lot of economic impact. They're essential for education and engagement, and if you work with them, they're also good partners in advocacy. There is not much, or has not in the past been much interaction between those information silos, and that's a massive challenge. We've heard a lot about that this week. So I'm sure a number of you have seen this conceptual model of how BTT operates. When we first started in 1998, BTT at the center of the triangle here, the different stakeholders around at the points, there was hardly any direct communication between those different stakeholder groups back in 1998, 2000. And so a lot of that communication literally came through BTT, a lot of intermediary stuff. Now, the dashed arrows, there's a lot of communication that goes on directly among those groups. That's great progress where we are. There's other places, not so much. In Florida, that's definitely happening. Belize is starting to happen. Bahamas, we're starting to get there. But this is the kind of structure that I think is very important to follow. So I'm going to run quickly through a case study from where I am in East Central Florida. Where are we pointing? Okay. So you can see in the lower left, the globe, Florida, East Central Coast, a place called Indian River Lagoon. I would consider it highly polluted at this point, and I'll explain some of that now. So how do the resource management agencies assess the health of the Indian River Lagoon? There's a number of environmental factors that they use to try and figure out what's going on and fix Indian River Lagoon. The one we'll focus on today is seagrass. They've long used seagrass aerial extent or coverage as a metric for the health of the Indian River Lagoon. On the left side, you can see up with the light, but most of the dark areas are thick seagrass 20 years ago. On the right is now. You can see sand flats. So we basically lost almost all of our seagrass because of pollution issues and harmful algal blooms. The effort now is to try and rebuild that and restore it, but there's a lot of confusion on exactly where that effort should go. So getting to the seagrass aerial coverage. Okay. So how the state has monitored this, on the left you see the aerial extent in hectares, years at the bottom. That blue line is when we had a harmful algal bloom that lasted for months and killed a lot of seagrass. That you can see the aerial extent, it dropped considerably, a little bit of a rebound, then we had another algae bloom, and it really tanked out. And so they were using that as a metric, and they said before the algae bloom in 2010, everything was going great. But my conversations with people who'd fished the area for a long time, they said the lagoon was declining before that algae bloom. So I used an interview process, sat down with a chart, a bunch of different markers of different colors, and okay, I sat down with 10 guides and anglers who'd been fishing the area for more than 40 years, asked them to draw their top go-to spots. Not everywhere they fished, but if they had to get a client on fish, where did they go? And by decade, as you can see there. Basically, our premise was that fish integrate ecological factors, right? And they go where they're good habitat or proxy for habitat health. The fishermen go where the fish are, right? Makes sense. And so we're using fishing effort as a good monitoring tool for habitat health over time. We can get some trend lines. So just to give you an idea, in the 1990s on the left, they showed me 254 hotspots. On the right is the 2000s decade that we're in now, down to 93. That's tremendous change, right? Because there just weren't that many places with sufficient habitat to support the fishery. So you might think that that jibes with, if you look at bar graph, and I'll kind of build up on this bar graph now, you can see 1990s to 2000s, there was a decline in number of fishing and spatial fishing effort. So something was going on there. So if we take a look at that seagrass cover, the green bars at the top, and we instead look at percent cover within meter squared quadrats, You can see the percent cover of seagrass is dropping precipitously from the 1990s through the 2000s, even before that algae bloom. So there's other things going on affecting the environment. And that's the same time that the fishing effort already started to decline. So looking in hindsight, if we would have been working with the fishermen on a monitoring program like this, before the algae bloom caused that huge decline, we may have been able to pick up some of the problems before the thing kind of fell off the cliff. And our goal now is to use the same information to help inform restoration, basically incorporate fishermen information into the whole monitoring and management process. To put it in pictures, on the left, thick seagrass, on the right, sparse seagrass. If you look at that as aerial coverage, they're both seagrass, right? But from a fishing, and ecological perspective, those are very different habitats. So parsing that out is only possible using the people on the water all the time. So again, a lot of pushback on sample size, only 10. Ben showed this the other day. Striped bass fishery in Massachusetts, 170,000 anglers. They were able to accurately describe the fishery with interviews for only 33. In social science and health sciences, key informant surveys, they reached an asymptote at 10 consistently. You don't need massive sample size. You just need a good sample design. In addition, there aren't that many people fishing 40 plus years in the fishery. So I think 10, we probably had a pretty good proportion. And then I want to go through, still have 2 minutes? 3, okay. The challenges, how this works. You can't just show up and say, hey, tell me where you fish. Anybody know fishermen who tells you where they fish? You have to develop relationships, and this is long-term engagement. This has come up a couple times this week. You need continuity. You just can't show up and have a relationship for a crisis. You have to have a relationship now, so when the crisis occurs in the future, you already have the trust built. Nellie talked about this a bit, and she was there. They trusted her, but they didn't trust her student that she sent. So we need to have succession plans, a structural framework. So I introduce, say, my students, or even better, my employees, who are going to be there for a while, and they become also part of that communication network. We can't have this kind of on-again, off-again thing. It's hard for universities to do because we're based on student projects, but that's something that fisheries management agencies need to put a lot of effort into, assigning people to be those communicators, because we need to maintain the relationships. Stakeholder integration, as I said, they're all stakeholders. The Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute has an annual meeting in the Caribbean. If you're in that region, it's well worth it because that's entirely how they're set up. Managers, fishers, commercial, recreational, researchers are all together having conferences just like this. We also have to realize that within and between agencies that are managing, there's not a lot of integration. And I'm not speaking to other agencies that are here, but my own experience. In Florida, for example, the scientists in the state resource management agencies aren't talking to the policymakers. It's a learning process. There's no one size that fits all. You have to spend the time. And there's a lot of local power dynamics, right? You can't just go in and say, hey, it's me, I'm going to work with you. There's all types of internal politics. And then finally, because I'm running out of time, there are ways for you to evaluate the success of what you're doing. It's well spelled out in the literature. A bit too much detail for now. So with that, I will end and take any questions if there's time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Erin. That was really interesting and lots of similarities. I love the idea of boundary organizations, really important. We've got time for one question. Do we have any questions? No questions. Okay, well, that was very clear then. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure if this was planned. Our next presenter is Bruce Mann. So I get to introduce my husband, but I won't do any of the introduction, Bruce.